at the end of the storm. It's a golden rain and the sweet silver sound of love. Walk on through the storm. Walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on, walk on, with a hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You walk on, walk on, with a hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You when you walk through the storm, hold your head up flower grows. I believe that somewhere in a darkest night a candle glows, and I believe that everyone who goes astray someone will come and show the way home. I believe
for to carry me home. I never shall forget that day, coming for to carry me home. When Jesus washed my sins away, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. And the angels are coming after me, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot.
All right, that was our initial slideshow with pictures from the book. Let's see, Mary, would you like to start?
Yes, I will. Good afternoon and welcome. I am Mary Nettles, President of the Chatham Community NAACP and President of the Community Remembers Coalition Chatham. The panel discussion on Wilmington Live is sponsored by the Community Remembers Coalition Chatham and Chatham County NAACP chapters 5377 and 5378. We are so excited you can join us this afternoon, and we welcome and thank our presenters. You do not have to have read Wilmington Live or to have learned about this before this afternoon. We are going to learn together from our presenters, Adele Kelly, Amantha Davis, and our three panelists, Elizabeth Haddock, June Perry, and Carl Fox. Wilmington in New Hanover County, North Carolina, was the largest city with a thriving middle-class Black population until Thursday, November the 10th, 1898. Then everything changed. We hope you find this presentation enjoyable and educational. At this time, I will now turn it over to Amantha Davis to introduce herself, followed by Adele Kelly, Then Amantha Davis will introduce panelists June Perry and Carl Fox, and Adele Kelly will introduce panelist Elizabeth Haddock. So now please sit back and relax, and don't forget to mute your device. Audience, you may use the chat feature for questions. Thanks again for being here.
Hello, my name is Armitha Davis. Good afternoon. I reside in Montreux, North Carolina. I am a member of Wars Memorial Church, Sanford, North Carolina, a member of the NAACP and CRC-C. I have 4 sisters and 5 brothers, and I have 2 dogs, Candy and Little Bit. Good afternoon, Adele.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adele Kelly, and I'm a retired educator who worked for 20 years as a high school teacher and department coordinator for special education exceptional students in Brighton, New York, a suburb of Rochester. After I retired in 2016, my husband and I moved to Bluffton, South Carolina, where I volunteered with South Carolina's ACLU on issues dealing with the school to prison pipeline. We did outreach to parents of students who were in exceptional children programs. We moved to Pittsburgh in 2017 to be closer to family. I've done volunteer work for the local Democrat Party through voter registration and spearheading postcard campaigns for political candidates. I enjoy movies, reading nonfiction, spending time with our sons, daughters, and grandchildren, and look forward to someday traveling again.
Okay. I will now introduce Mrs. June Carter Perry. Mrs. June Carter Perry is a former United States ambassador to Sierra Leone. She also served in the United States Department of Directors in the Office of Social Humanitarian Affairs. Mrs. Perry is currently on the board of directors of American Diplomacy Publishers in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Mrs. June Perry and her husband Frederick has 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. I'd like to welcome Mrs. June Carter Perry. Now we'll introduce Mr. Carl Fox. Good afternoon, Mr. Carl Fox. Mr. Fox is a former Superior Court judge for over 40 years here in North Carolina judicial system. He was the first Black district attorney and the first Black judicial judge to serve in Chatham-Orange District 15B. Welcome, Mr. Carl Fox.
Hello, I'd like to welcome Miss Elizabeth Haddock. Elizabeth joined the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law in 2019 and serves as the managing attorney of the North Carolina Regional Office. She was co-director of the UNC Julius Chambers Center for Civil Rights from 2010 to 2017, when the UNC Board of Governors banned the UNC Center for Civil Rights Center's legal advocacy. Ms. Haddock served as the center's senior staff attorney, leading the center's innovative racial justice docket in the area of environmental science. Elizabeth is currently litigating landmark environmental justice, police misconduct, voting rights, and educational equity cases on behalf of organizational and individual clients. She grew up in Mississippi, earned her BA from Duke University, taught public high school in Eastern North Carolina before earning a JD from the UNC School of Law in 1998. Welcome.
At this time, I think Mr. Evan Johnson is going to do housekeeping. Is that right?
Sure, yes. Thank you all so much for being part of this. And the main thing
Evan?
is just to stay muted unless you need to talk. And if you have any problems, you can put those into the chat. And if you have any questions you would like our panelists to cover, if we don't cover them in the questions we've already selected, we can try to fit some of those in toward the end of our program today. That's about it.
Okay. At this time, I will read the biography of Mr. David Zucchino. David Zucchino is the author of Wilmington's Life. He is a contributing writer for the New York Times. David has covered wars and civil conflicts in more than 36 countries. Zucchino was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his dispatches from apartheid South Africa, and he is a 4-time Pulitzer Prize finalist for his reporting from Iraq, Lebanon, South Africa, and inner city Philadelphia. David is the author of Thunder Run and Myth of the Welfare Queen. He is a UNC Chapel Hill graduate with a BA in journalism and English. David Zucchino is the Pulitzer Prize 2020 winner for the non-fictional #1 bestseller of Wilmington's Life. He is greatly respected and admired by his peers. Mr. David Zucchino, author of Wilmington's Life.
Thank you, Armenta.
Adele.
I'm going to read a brief summary of the book, especially for those who may not have read it. In Wilmington's Life, Zucchino uses contemporary newspaper accounts, diaries, and official communications to create a gripping narrative that weaves together individual stories of hate, fear, and brutality. By the 1890s, Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city and a shining example of a mixed race community with a 56% Black population. It was a bustling port city with a thriving African-American middle class and a fusion government of Republicans and populists that included Black aldermen, Black police officers, and Black magistrates. At the time, there were two dominant political parties with counter beliefs from today's political parties. The then Democratic Party, comprised of former Confederates, Whigs, and conservatives, evolved into the party of the white supremacists, the white man's party. The Republican Party of the time believed in a strong central government, was joined by the populists and the Fusion Party, and supported Black involvement in government. The Wilmington of 1898 had successful Black businesses and an African-American newspaper called the Daily Record, owned by Alexander Manley. A speech given by a white woman, Rebecca Latimer Felton, said that white men had to rise in defense of Southern womanhood against the threat of Black predators. Manley refuted Miss Felton's statements by saying that some relationships between Black men and women were consensual. White supremacists used his editorial to further ignite outrage across the South and call for his lynching. North Carolina's white supremacists had a strategy of writing newspaper articles and political cartoons of disinformation to perpetrate the belief that the Blacks were planning to overtake November's election. This false campaign was spearheaded by Josephus Daniels, the owner and publisher of Raleigh's News and Observer, the state's largest newspaper. Together with Furnifold Simmons, chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party, former Confederate Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell, and other white supremacists, they rolled out a carefully orchestrated campaign that included rallies, race-baiting editorials and fabricated news stories. With intimidation and violence, the Democrats suppressed Black votes and stuffed ballots to ballot boxes to win control of the legislature in November 8th, 1898. On November 10th, more than 2,000 heavily armed white supremacists called red shirts swarmed through Wilmington, shooting at least 60 Black men, terrorizing hundreds of the city's Black women and children who ran to an area cemetery, swamp, and woods for safety. These rioters forced city officials to resign at gunpoint and replace them with mob leaders. Many prominent Blacks had to leave their wealth and careers behind as they were banished from Wilmington and told never to return. By the spring of 1899, some 2,800 Blacks had left Wilmington. This brutal insurrection is an example of a violent overthrow of an elected government in the United States. It halted gains made by Blacks and encouraged racism as an official government policy, cementing white rule for another half century. It is not a race riot as the events of November 1898 came to be known, but rather a racially motivated coup launched by white supremacists.
The first question goes to Mrs. Jean Perry. Had the coup been penetrated by groups such as Black Lives Matter or Antifa, would the government have persecuted some or all of the members who were involved in the coup? Mrs. Perry.
Thank you very much for the question. Just before I answer that, I would just like to note that I earned my graduate degree at the University of Chicago under the direction of Professor John Hope Franklin, whose own father, lawyer Buck Franklin, had his offices destroyed during the Tulsa riots. And therefore, we know that this type of activity has continued throughout American history. I also had the opportunity to be a lecturer at the University of Maryland in the Department of History in teaching African American history. In terms of the issue of the government's prosecution of various groups, I would say, had the aforementioned coup been carried out by Black Lives Matter, Antifa, or their sympathizers, the government would have prosecuted the participants to the fullest extent of the law. They would have been arrested and likely executed, as was Nat Turner following his rebellion in Virginia, as well as that of his followers. The lynching of Blacks is, or their sympathizers, has been a constant theme throughout American history. Mass incarceration of people of color continues today in 2021. And only through DNA evidence and the intervention of organizations such as the Innocence Project and the NAACP Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights are a few, and I mention only a few, of the wrongly accused individuals been released. This remains a sad element of our judicial system. It remains unsafe to drive while Black, as we have seen in recent months. In fact, to live freely as any person of color is a challenge. 18 states are considering voting law restriction and have dismantled these rights, these constitutional rights of American citizens, regardless of their ethnicity on a regular basis. Because of this horrific history, and sad to say, the untoward feelings of members of our society, I fear that the young people involved in Black Lives Matter or any similar organization could never escape terrible punishment had they carried out any type of killing of other individuals, particularly white individuals in this society, without severe punishment or death.
Thank you, Ambassador Perry. I would like to now address a question to Miss Elizabeth Haddix. And the question is, why do white people have difficulties with Black people's self-assertion? To what extent does white anger still exist in the 21st century? What is or was the source of white anger? And what about Black anger?
Thanks, Adele. I'm not going to attempt to speak for Black people, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak for all white people, but I'm going to and speak from just some recent examples that have been shown to me through my work as a civil rights lawyer. And I think I want to start maybe by answering the next to last question in there, sort of the source, right? Which I think Zucchino's book really begins to illuminate. I think the one thing I would say is that I wanted a little bit more of the illumination, right, of the source of white people's anger, and really the source of this false narrative that you can still see reflected in the plaques that we saw on some of the slides opening this presentation, the refusal to name what happened on November 10th and in the days preceding and the days following as a race, labeling it a race riot instead of labeling what it was. It was a white supremacist massacre of Black people, Black leadership. It was the carrying out of a program that had been put in place long before that to get rid of Black people who had any power whatsoever, whether it be economic or as a community leader. And that program was put in place by very powerful and wealthy white people who were intent on creating this lie that Black people were taking power away from white people and taking jobs and taking resources and land and wealth. And this is, I was taught back, when I was in my teens by Black leaders in Eastern North Carolina, the source of racism is economic oppression. It is a lie that has been told to white people since the time of slavery to oppress poor white people and to pit poor people against each other and to convince white people that they have currency in their skin. And that actually came to be, right? That is true now. As a white person, your skin is a currency. As a Black person, it's, it could put you in prison or in a grave. So, this I think is the source of it. And just, I wanted to sort of show y'all something. Visuals are helpful to me, and I hope they are here. But in two cases, and I'm just going to show you, these are public documents. These are filings in two court cases that we have. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law has brought on behalf of Black people in two cases. One in the Alamance County case, which I'm sure you all have heard about, that is linked to Zucchino's book in the sense that it was on October 31st, 2020, a voting rights march, a march to the polls led by Reverend Gregory Drumright and Justice for the Next Generation and Alamance Alliance for Justice. A few hundred participants in that march, including elderly, people of faith, community leaders, children, disabled people, gathered for a diverse, racially and able-bodied, diverse march to the polls on the last day of early voting and one-stop voting and registration across the state, but in Alamance County in downtown Graham. And this sort of goes to Ambassador Perry's last point. What would have happened had this mob of racists who had, who perpetrated this massacre in Wilmington been Black? And I heard Ben Crump say at a recent press conference in our Alamance County litigation, actually at the criminal trial of Reverend Drumright, because of course he was charged with felonies and misdemeanors by Alamance County Sheriff's Office for actions that they allege he took on October 31st. This is after the Alamance County Sheriff's Office and Grand Police had pepper sprayed those marchers who were within moments of their not even finishing a memorial to George Floyd. They were kneeling in the street. They were getting up from their feet, and the Graham police pepper sprayed them and yelled at them to move or be arrested. That was the first incident of pepper spray, and then there was a second and a third. But the narrative that has been brought by the Alamance County Sheriff's Office and the Grand Police in that case, and I'm not going to share those papers just for the sake of time, but was that these marchers were violent, that Reverend Drumright and his people with him, in the volunteers, the youth that are volunteering in Justice for the Next Generation, who were setting up sound equipment and a stage and making a peaceful gathering of community leaders and helping people get on the stage to speak, were violent and out of control and had to be dispersed. And that is the narrative. They deny, the government denies that this was a voting rights march at all. They prefer to depict it as a protest of the Confederate monument that still stands in front of the historic courthouse in the center of Graham. The second case, and this is the part I really wanted to show that goes to this question of white person's anger, is the case, and I'll go ahead and try to share my screen here. I can, if technology will help us. This is a case in Pender County, North Carolina, that some of you may have heard about, involving a mob of white people, 15 or more white people who on May 3rd of 2020, just a couple of months after the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery by a white vigilante neighborhood patrol person, who believed he was a threat because he was Black. And then only a few months after the slaying of Breonna Taylor in her home while she slept by police officers who had the wrong address. This group of 15 white people in Pender County, North Carolina, looking for a missing juvenile, had came onto the porch at 10:30 at night on a Sunday of our clients, Monica and Damian Shepherd, a single Black mother and her teenage son, who lived in a community. They're one of the few, there's just a couple of other African-American families on that street, or families that have mixed race children on that street. And the mob believed that this missing juvenile was with a Black boy named Josiah. And so they came to, we're still determining how they found our client's address, but we believe that it was because they knew that a Black teenage boy lived at that address, and they were looking for a Black teenage boy. And they banged on the door. The person at the head of the crowd was dressed he was in his sheriff deputy's uniform. He had a gun on his hip, exposed gun on his hip. The man standing behind him had an AR-15, which is an automatic assault weapon, the one that's used in the school slayings and other mass killings in this country in recent years. And there was a third person with a shotgun. And as soon as Damian opened the door, they began yelling at him, saying, "Are you Josiah? Are you Josiah?" His mother woke up and came running to the door, pushed her son aside, was afraid that they would both wind up dead, but particularly wanted to protect her son. And the Pender County Sheriff's Office arrived at the call after being called by their neighbors. They had actually been working together with this group of white people to look for this girl, and knew that they were in the neighborhood. And they made no arrests. They didn't question anyone. They didn't arrest anyone. After attention was brought to this by our clients and their attorneys, the charges were brought. And they were, the DA, Ben David, did prosecute those charges. The defendants were found not guilty. And there was no appeal of that decision. So we filed this case on their behalf, and this is the amended, this is the answer of two of the defendants. Jordan Kita was the person in the sheriff deputy's uniform. And what I wanted to share with you is that when we filed our complaint, and I'm not going to show that, I'm happy to give copies of this. These are all public documents, but we framed this as our clients taught us to, in the historical context in which they experienced the terror of May 3rd of 2020. And that we brought up Ahmaud Arbery, we brought up Breonna Taylor, we brought up the history of white people acting either directly with law enforcement officials or on their own as sort of vigilante enforcers of the law, as the folks, as the red shirts did, right, in Wilmington in 1898. And we told that story. We told the story through our clients' eyes. And this is the response you can see from the defendants. These historical narratives contain no allegations, no statement of law. They've moved to strike all of our, and Judge Fox will know what I'm talking about, our introductory paragraphs that give the context of this lawsuit. They refer to them as irrelevant, immaterial, and impertinent, scandalous in nature, intended to prejudice arbitrarily the fact finder against these defendants. And then they file claims against our clients. And I'm just scrolling down here. They've got an answer, they've got their defenses. And then at page 22, they begin filing claims against our clients. And these are their base allegations for those, that their actions, even though they were looking for a Black boy, their actions were wholly unrelated to race. That they just can't understand why we say this is about race. They can't understand why the shepherds don't understand that this is about race. The Pender County Sheriff's Office officer who came to the scene told Monica and Damien that they needed to put themselves in the position of these white people who were looking for this missing child, that they needed to consider how upset those people were. And they didn't need to press charges or do anything that would exacerbate the hardship that these white people were having. And so, you can see this. They accuse our clients of using a political media, feeding a political media frenzy, using race baiting, trumping up charges. I mean, we know where all of this, these words are all familiar, right, from our last presidential reign. So, I just thought it would be interesting to see that rather than talk about it, since these are cases in litigation, and I'm not going to share anything that's not public information, but we still have a very big problem with this white blindness and refusal to understand the world through any lens except their own white privilege.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to need to move on a little bit.
Yeah, please do.
This question goes to Judge Carl Fox. Judge Fox, did you know about Wilmington coup before reading David Zucchino's book? If so, what was your understanding of the event recounted in the book?
Good afternoon. First, let me say I did know about the event slightly before the book. I read the book, but I was sort of like the gentleman in a panel discussion several months ago when the Tulsa coup was being discussed, and they were talking about the events on Black Wall Street, and they said, and this young African-American man said, that didn't happen. That's not true. And people were saying, well, yes, it is true. And he said, well, I've never heard or seen or read about that. And they assured him it was in fact true. I had never seen or read anything about this in any North Carolina history book in high school or in college. And the way I learned about it was on the 16th of June, 2020, after George Floyd's death. Frank Daniels III announced to the media that they were voluntarily taking down the statue of Josephus Daniels in Nash Square in Raleigh. If you're not familiar with, I held a lot of court in Raleigh, and I was born in Raleigh, so I'm quite familiar with Raleigh. And Nash Square is a square that's boxed in by Dawson Street on the west side, McDowell Street on the east side, Martin on the south side, and Hargett Street on the north side. It is directly behind the old News and Observer building, which was actually fronted Salisbury Street next to the Justice Center in Wake County. And I thought that, well, that's unusual. And then the story came out that he was literally the catalyst for the, as it was termed, the Wilmington riot in 1898, and that he was a white supremacist, and he had used his paper to incite people to take arms and riot in Wilmington. And as has been stated earlier, that's an inaccurate statement of what happened. When you read the book, you know that that Black people couldn't buy arms at the time immediately prior to this coup. It was a coup. It wasn't about people fighting with each other in a sort of a rioting situation. It was about literally an unarmed Black community, and unarmed people going to vote, Black people who had voted, who were being confronted by armed white men and shot down and forced to resign positions and forced to leave Wilmington back at that time. And so I know now what the events are, but I did not know at the time. And just like the Tulsa riot coup, that was a coup also. I'm glad this is all coming out, because as before this came out, people pointed to the Nat Turner rebellion as being this horrible thing that occurred back in the time. And the truth of the matter is that the folks who went after Nat Turner ended up killing nearly twice as many people as the actual number of people involved in the rebellion itself. And in this situation, you had people killing innocent people, and in a situation where they had no present ability to really defend themselves against this mob. And so I'm glad that David Zucchino wrote this book, and I hope at some point it will be incorporated to North Carolina history books, so that people are aware of this and other events that took place during those times. Because right now it causes me to question the accounts of anything about North Carolina history that is currently preserved in those books.
Thank you. Adele. Adele.
I'm sorry, I was talking to myself. This question is to June Perry, and it's much controversy surrounds critical race theory. What are your thoughts on adding CRT to our school curricula?
Thank you for that question. Let me say, first of all, there is no such thing as race. We need to dispel that notion immediately. Those of you who have read Caste by Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson will realize that there is a systemic tendency, I'll say, in societies to place individuals at certain levels or certain tiers within that society, regardless of the country or continent. Critical race theory is not a diversity and inclusion training, but a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society that is merged often in the legal, in the legal academy, and often in other fields of scholarship. I would like to note also that one definition is that legal scholars study this theory that originated amongst the legal academy, as I stated, to study the intersection of systemic racism and the law. There is a general deliberate misunderstanding and misinterpretation of critical race theory. And there is a deliberate distortion and representation of critical race theory by individuals who do not understand it or deliberately use the term to advance their own political or social agendas, including rewriting American history or reinforcing American history that omits the achievements of persons of color. I would like to just share a few examples of that for a moment. How many students are taught that World War II was won because of Navajo code breakers? that thousands of people's lives were saved in World War I because of Dr. Charles Drew's work on plasma, or that Garrett Morgan invented the traffic light, that Dr. William Hale did the first open heart surgery at Chicago's Providence Hospital in the late 19th century, and that Lewis Latimer actually developed the filament that Edison used to create the electric light. So as you can see, critical race theory is actually a concept used in legal studies, in legal schools. It is not used or should not be used for teaching elementary school children or high school students or even college students. It is a field of study that has been very much considered by legal scholars. Therefore, in a sense, not in a sense, in reality, as a historian and as a former professor, I would say it is totally incorrect to use critical race theory in the teaching of young children or even older children. It could be used by professionals in the legal field who truly understand the meaning of critical race theory. Sadly, as I mentioned, this has been used as a tool to target people, unfortunately, who have not been educated in true American history, and to frighten people who do not know American history. And it is to make them fear that there is something wrong with critical race theory itself, when in fact, for a law student, it's perfectly fine. For a graduate student looking at systems within societies or countries and within the strata, one might say, of those societies, CRT is valid. It is not valid as an educational, or as I mentioned, a training system within a school system. And it is most unfortunate that individuals who are most susceptible to accepting views that are totally unproven, it is most unfortunate that they are the ones who are causing very difficult discussions and unnecessary discussions, frankly, amongst teachers, amongst parents who have no idea truly of what CRT is. I have looked into this and talked with at least one Columbia Law graduate who is now a practicing lawyer about this in terms of defining it, as well as doing my own research on it. It is not something I studied, although I did a lot of international law. Critical race theory is not something that I studied in my particular field, but I have learned quite a bit about it, and it does not pertain to teaching our children in grammar or high school or even college.
Thank you. This question is from Ms. Elizabeth Hack. Josephus Daniel, publisher of News and Observer, and Furniture Simmons, chairman of the state's Democratic Party, able to spread the anger and fears of white population through an intentional campaign of disinformation. Is today's public as global as it was at the turn of the 20th century, or given the impact of social media, or perhaps more? Mrs. Elizabeth George.
I mean, I think, is today's public as gullible as the public of Wilmington 1898 was. I think absolutely, and Ambassador Perry's point proves it, right? Her comments prove that point. That you know, I understand that in the halls of our legislature, in the committee meeting rooms, and that the Republicans, leading members of the party, are encouraging their fellow representatives and senators to oppose any legislation that is put forward by the other party that has anything to do with funding or protecting the public good, as a conspiracy of critical race theory. Fear is a very effective tactic to control people. And it is used most effectively against people who are not properly educated, who don't have a good education. And so that is our best defense, if you will. I don't want to use the word weapon, to fighting back against the ignorance and the sort of messaging that's being perpetrated on us and taking away our public good.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I have a second question for Judge Fox. In your opinion, was the coup of 1898 by white supremacists due to the editorial written by Alex Manly regarding the purity of white women, or was it a hoax to remove Black men from political office and take their possessions?
Well, let's see. In order to address that question, I really think it would be helpful, especially for people who haven't read the book, to hear what we're talking about. And Alex Manly was a very opinionated person. He suppressed his opinion to some extent, but there were things that sort of ticked him off, as the word, as I would phrase it. And one of them was the railing against Black men and putting them somehow forward as being beasts and animals and people unworthy of respect. At one time, when Black ministers attempted to placate the white supremacists in the community, he wrote an earlier editorial where he said that it was in the Daily Record, it's called Mistaken Policy. He accused the pastors of abandoning their race to curry favor with whites. He pointed out that they had failed to mention to the white men who raped Black women with impunity, that if the pastors were so concerned about rape and punishment, Manly wrote, then the law should apply equally to Blacks and whites, not just to unfortunate Black paramours caught with white women. And this was the start of the precursor to the editorial that raised so much controversy. And it came after this woman by the name of Rebecca Felton went on this tirade. She had formed an opinion that Black men were fiends, and that for them to, quote, the Black fiend to lay his unholy and lustful hands on a white woman was, in the state of Georgia, should be punishable by death. And she was the wife of a U.S. representative from Georgia, and she went on to make a statement where give a speech where she said, if it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary, she shouted. The men's shouts and cheers reverberated off the hall's rafters, and they cheered her to echo, as she put it. So in response to that, Alex Manly wrote this editorial, which raised a lot of controversy. He said a Mrs. Felton from Georgia made a speech before the Agricultural Society at, at Tybee, Georgia, in which she advocates lynching as an extreme measure. This one makes a strong plea for womanhood, and if the alleged crimes of rape were half so frequent as is oftentimes reported, her plea would be worthy of consideration. The papers are filled often with reports of rapes of white women and the subsequent lynchings of the alleged rapists. The editors pour forth volumes of aspersions against all Negroes because of the few who may be guilty. If the papers and speakers of the other race would condemn the commission of crime because it is crime and not try to make it appear that the Negroes were the only criminals, they would find their strongest allies in the intelligent Negroes themselves. We suggest that the whites guard their women more closely, as Mrs. Felton says, thus giving no opportunity for the human fiend, be he white or black. You leave your goods out of doors and then complain because they are taken away. Poor white men are careless in the matter of protecting their women, especially on the farms. Our experience among poor white people in the country teaches us that the women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than the white men with colored women. Meetings of this kind go on for some time until the woman's infatuation or the man's boldness brings attention to them and the man is lynched for rape. Every Negro lynched is called a, quote, big, burly, black brute, unquote, when in fact, many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers and were not only, quote, black and, quote, burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is very well known to all. Mrs. Felton must begin at the fountainhead if she wishes to purify the stream. Teach your men purity. Let virtue be something more than an excuse for them to intimidate and torture a helpless people. Tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites in that you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours. Don't think ever that your women will remain pure while you are debauching ours. You sow the seed, the harvest will come in due time. Unquote. Now that was a very strong statement by a black man in those times. And there's no doubt about it that it got published by literally every white newspaper in North Carolina to bring attention to this editorial and Alex Manley. He suffered death threats. He and his brother Frank suffered death threats. They were reviled, they were threatened with lynching, and they probably would have been lynched, but Josephus Daniels and Furnifold Simmons felt like that wasn't the time to do it, that at some later point it should be done. And in fact, an Irishman named Mike Dowling was stopped from doing it on election day. And so you had this incendiary editorial, but that was not the reason for all this. This was not the driving force for all this. The driving force for all this was that people like Josephus Daniels and Furnifold Simmons and Alfred Waddell and Roger Moore and William Saunders and people like that just had what they called a Negro problem, a Negro domination problem, a Negro rule problem, a Negroization problem, and they saw any black person in any good job, in the elected position as a threat, and that they were not tolerant of any of it. And even though with the integration of Wilmington at the time, which was really in some ways a model for the rest of the state of North Carolina. It was in most ways, but even there, where the population of Black people outnumbered the population of white people, they were not in the majority of the jobs. They were never in the majority of the jobs. And it was as we put it today, it was in the former president's words, it was fake news. It was totally fake news. And just like today, the parallel with that, what went on there is a parallel with today, that you have the same type of people today railing against the vaccine, shouting against masks, and talking. I saw a lady the other day on television say, shine a light on you and you'll show green. And that means you're no longer human because the vaccine has made you not human. That is a talk of lunacy, literally. And we have the same kind of people who were persuaded by this awful, racist, white supremacist rhetoric in 1890s, the same kind of people being swayed by this vaccination, anti-vax, anti-mask rhetoric today. And so the sad part is, the good part is the rhetoric isn't as much for these people about race, although there probably is some racial tint to their thinking, because I don't care what anyone says about these Confederate statues and this Confederate flag. When people cling to that heritage, they're claiming to the very same thing that's being talked about in this book. That's the heritage of that flag, and that's the heritage of those statues. And so I think the editorial has always been sort of a faux reason for this coup. The real reason for the coup was white supremacy and the need to take over all these jobs and put all the Black people in these jobs out of work and displace them from Wilmington. And I think that's plain and simple.
Thank you, Judge Fox. Well said.
All right. Shall we break into small groups for just a little bit, and then we'll come back for some more questions? The question I'd like for y'all to consider in small groups, and you'll be in groups of about 2 or 3, is we remember the response of Governor of North Carolina, Daniel Russell Jr., and the U.S. President, William McKinley. What prevented both of them, these men in power, as well as other whites in Wilmington, from intervening in the coup? And what are ways that we, you and I, can walk our talk courageously and make our voices heard when the rights, well-being, and equity and equality of others are being attacked? So that's something to talk about in our breakout rooms. Let's see here. And again, you'll have about 2 to 3 people. There we go. In our breakout rooms. If you have any questions, there should be a button you can press. And let's just take 10 minutes, and I'll put that question in the chat once y'all get in the rooms so that you have that question again. But we're asking, why did the people who could have done something, especially the people with relative power in the situation, why did they not do something? And what can you and I do today and when we see similar things? Enjoy your 10 minutes. We have a few user submitted questions, so I want to share those, and any of the panelists who would like to answer certainly can. One is from Mary Ann and says, how does legislation set on banning discussing race critically in the classroom affect getting the story of Wilmington told? And I know Ambassador Perry spoke very well about critical race theory and the nuances of that, but do any of the panelists want to talk about how any of that political discussion might affect getting this story of Wilmington told?
Well, if the teachers aren't allowed to teach uh, the events in the book, uh, and parents, as I said earlier, I think that there's been such a distortion of this legal concept that people are totally confused, or they've been misled by their political leaders to think it's something else. So I think we really have to depend on the teachers to be accurate in their teaching of American history. And I know it's very hard because these states are coming up with laws left and right, urging the teachers not to do so. But the conversation that Ms. Kelly and I just had with Mr. Duncan, who was a former educator in Virginia, often even the teachers who are very aware of what should be taught, according to what he was saying, I think, is that many of those teachers aren't listened to. And the parents, unfortunately, may or may not have had a solid education themselves.
Another question, thank you, is from Jane. She says the tactics and false narratives used by the powerful whites to nurture and grow poor whites' fear, anger, and resentment towards Black people is nothing new. So what can people do? What can be antidotes today to these familiar tactics? False narratives is not new. So knowing and acknowledging that this is not a new tactic that some people use with ill intent, what can be done against those false narratives?
Well, one of the things you can do is you can stand up for people who have courage. I mean, I'll give you an example. It took real courage for the Chatham County Commissioners to take down that statue in front of the courthouse. I've been driving around that circle since I started in 1978, and I've had African American citizens in Chatham County tell me that some of them wouldn't even report for jury service because they hated that statue so much. And there was, if any of you saw this, there were protests out there literally daily, big Confederate flags and people waving them and standing there. And when the commissioners voted to take it down, then there was all this talk of what was going to happen afterwards. And quite smartly, they had it removed in the middle of the night, and it was gone the next day. And there was a protest for a day or two. You go by there now, and there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And then that statue isn't there either. And that was a lot of talk. That was what was going to happen if that happened. And I think that people in all ways, in all walks of life, have to stand up and not be tolerant by silence of this behavior that's reprehensible, that's racist, that's anti-women, anti-LGBTQ, that's anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-Hispanic, anti-immigrant, and because it's the silence that keeps that going. And we have to be as vigilant now as we were vigilant last year, because every day you see people and I call them the 39s, that 39% that supported the former president come hell or high water. Every day they have something negative to say about something. And we have to be as keen and aware and as assertive and active as they are if we don't want them to take the advantage again.
I agree. I think we have to speak out, and we don't leave vacuums of information and give them platforms. But I would also encourage us to to beware of the distraction that they're causing, and the energy drain that results from having to always come back and answer these these insane allegations and declarations. We need to get smart about a plan, a 10-year, a 15-year plan that dismantles white supremacy and that deals with our education system and that deals with our criminal justice system. And I would rather spend the next 25 years, I just spent 25 years in this work as a civil rights lawyer, and I'm really starting to think about the way I'm going to spend the next 25 years of my work. And it might involve less talking and more planning and strategizing and meeting and coming up with a blueprint, just like they did 40 years ago, to take our courts, to take our school boards, to take our county commissions, and to turn us into a country where 1% own everything and the rest of us work too much. So that's why I'm in favor.
Thank you. Are there any last closing remarks from any of the panelists that you'd like to share before we just tell you about upcoming events and give our thanks? I'll mute.
I just want to thank y'all for putting this together, and it's so nice to be with you. I had a really good time with Ambassador Sharpless on our little 2-room meeting, and I'm so proud to live in Chatham County. I'm so proud of our county commissioners and our feisty NAACP branch. And so just thanks for having this and inviting me to speak at it.
Great.
See, I see that Stuart Ravitz has a question. Do you have a question you'd like to ask? You can unmute.
Yeah, I just had a question about, I mean, I agree with Elizabeth on a lot of this stuff because we're friends and we talk about this stuff. And in the small group that I was in, we talked about the issue of, without sounding complimentary, I think the GOP is like the Soviets and the Germans, where they plan 30, 40, 50 years ahead and they plant these little things. And they decided a long time ago that they couldn't win the overall big picture. So they've taken it down to the minute level with the school boards and the town councils and the state legislatures and, the rural areas, and making it very hard to fight that. But my question really was, do you think the whole story of Wilmington and the whole issue of CRT has been done enough and talked about enough by the media? And by the media, I'm not talking about, Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow or whatever. I'm talking about like a 60 Minutes type thing. And the reason why I'm asking that is my niece and my nephew are 2 CBS News producers. She's the executive producer of 60 Minutes. And I'm just wondering if that's something we should pursue and see if we can, because a lot of people get more convinced by that type of thing than turning on an individual commentator and hearing 10 minutes of, Mark Robinson said this and Mark Robinson said that,
Are there any panelists that would like to respond? Yes, June?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I agree with you that we need to hear more voices that are explaining this is not, and CRT is not an issue for the general public. I mean, if you're a third-year law student, it might be relevant to you, but it would be very helpful, for example, if 60 Minutes did have a discussion about it, or as you mentioned, congratulations to your children or nieces, nephews being producers, that someone would explain, as I was trying to do so, based on the information from the American Bar Association and Columbia University, what this is, because it's been turned upside down to be something it totally isn't. So I think it would be very helpful if positive and intelligent producers would discuss this particular theory in its reality. It's not something for the everyday person on the street to deal with, and it's certainly not something for a fourth grade teacher to deal with.
Adele, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Elizabeth. She talked about, a 20-year plan. I mean, are there people working on such a thing, and how do we get involved?
I mean, email me. I think yes, I think there are people who are working on it. I know that, I have a lot of colleagues and people that I come across that are talking about these things, and we've all read, the books and the journalism and the research that was done on the right wings, how the right did it. And surely we have folks among our ranks that have the best interests of the public good, at heart, and are also brilliant leaders. I mean, there's a lot of them are here on this call, and we should be able to put something together. I think the question, the problem, I think, is our relationship to power, and the difference between our relationship to power and their relationship to power. And I think that's a question we need to wrestle with and get clear about, and then do it.
Thank you.
Any last closing words from our panelists before I turn it over to Bob Pearson to say a little something about an event we're having on September 18th?
I'm just going to add one more thing. When I contact my niece and nephew about this, I'm going to try to hook them up with Anthony Romero, the head of the ACLU. My younger sister went to high school with him, so I talked to him quite a bit. And maybe between them, they can come up with something to maybe put something out there in public view that's, not as scary to white people as, oh my God, somebody's going to tell my kids the truth in 6th grade, because I don't think it's as much a kid issue at this point as it is. The kids can be taught anything, but when they get home and their parents say, no, that's a crock of shit. BLM is burn, loot, and murder. It undoes whatever they get taught in school anyway. So, all right, I'll shut up now.
No, thank you for your question. Let's see, Bob, would you like to say a few things about the upcoming event?
I would. Thank you. But first of all, just want to thank you all for this terrific discussion and presentation this afternoon. I think that the discussion of these books is the nearest thing that we have at the moment to having a broad discussion of very difficult and very sensitive issues. And at the heart of this is history. On September 18, we are going to have a whole day set aside to remember and to celebrate the Black history of Chatham County. In the morning, we're going to have a memorial service for Eugene Daniel, the last person to be lynched in Chatham County. He was 8 days past his 16th birthday. on September 18, 1921. This will be the 100th anniversary of this lynching. And in the afternoon, we're going to have a number of people talk to us about Black history to celebrate it, its difficulties and its triumphs. A number of prominent public officials will be there. So we invite you to be there and to invite your friends to be there. If the discussion today has any takeaway for me, it is that when you remember history and you connect history, as we have done today, to the consequences that exist today, then you have a stronger resolve to do something about it. Personally, I'm not worried about the trolling from ignorant people or the far right about what they believe. I'm more concerned about us telling our story publicly and widely and persuasively, because then we will have the initiative and we will have the power to change the way that things exist today. So thank you very much for being here. Remember September 18, come and join us. Make this the best day that Chatham County has ever had in telling the history of the Black community. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is on our website, crc-c.org. It might be where you came to register. Also, as we leave the meeting, a short survey should pop up. We'd appreciate your help filling that out. It should take 2 minutes, and that will, I think, spit you out on this page where you can register for the next event if you'd like. All right, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your feedback. Thanks so much to the panelists. Thanks so much to the presenters, the facilitators. We really appreciate you making this a special event.